There is a very particular kind of dehumanization that women experience, and it's one that intensifies during pregnancy and motherhood. And this dehumanization comes from where your body suddenly becomes shared and is not entirely yours anymore. Your voice is dismissed, your needs are forgotten, and suddenly you're not yourself anymore. You're just your role, you're just what you give to others. You are no longer seen as a person but as a body to manage or as a role to perform. And this sense of loss that many women have experienced during this period of their lives is perfectly captured in the book The Yellow Wallpaper, a book that was written more than 100 years ago, but unfortunately is still relevant nowadays. Hello, my gorgeous viewers and readers. Welcome back and welcome if you're new. I hope your weekend was filled with beautiful flowers, gorgeous cold ice lattes, and the slightly unsettling feeling that something isn't quite right beneath the surface. Today, I want to talk about The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And even though this is a short story, this is actually one of the most disturbing things that I have read in a long time. This is proper horror, and especially taking into account that this story comes from Charlotte's experience. So this is actually a semi-autobiography, which makes it even worse. Because apart from the fact that the author actually received the same treatment that the narrator of the story receives, which is the rest cure treatment, what makes this story scarier, or what makes this story a horror novel in my experience, is the fact that we see the same topics that are still affecting our society even nowadays, or even 100 years later, which is, for example, the policing of women's bodies under the pretense of morality. And while the methods might look different today, the underlying pattern is not entirely familiar. And this is why I think this book deserves a much closer look. Just as a quick summary, the story follows an unnamed narrator who has recently given birth and is taken by her husband, John, who is also her doctor, to a country house for the summer. We're talking at a small country house where nothing seems to be going on and there is not much stimuli around, right? There's nothing to do around the area. So she is also diagnosed with what John calls temporary nervous condition and is prescribed complete rest, meaning no working, no household labor, no writing, which is something that she personally enjoys, but also most importantly, no stimulation whatsoever. So much so that she is actually confined into a small room within the country house, and no one can actually enter in apart from to do the bare minimum, right? She has no stimuli whatsoever. She can't even read books. The thing with this room is that it has a very strange wallpaper. It seems to be a really strange tone of yellow, but also seems to have patterns and little lines that you can follow around. So obviously, as the days pass, she becomes increasingly bored, but also increasingly fixated with this wallpaper because there is literally nothing that she can do, right? So the more the days pass, the more obsessed she becomes with this wallpaper, to the point where she starts seeing figures and starts seeing movement around the wallpaper and around the lines. So she becomes hyper fixated with this wallpaper until she starts believing that there is someone behind this wallpaper that is trying to get her. She is obviously very aware that her mental state is deteriorating, and also she notices that this isolation is actually affecting her gravely. So even though she tries to communicate to her husband and to everyone else around the house that she is struggling, obviously mentally but also physically because of this isolation, she only receives dismissals, especially from her husband or her doctor, up to the point where reality and these hallucinations become all mixed and this reality collapses. Before we go any further into this review, we need to make something very clear, and it's that this story is not just a story about someone's breakdown. This is a story about real medical malpractices that have been happening for thousands of years, especially in feminine medical care, and most importantly within pregnancy and motherhood. But also, this is a story about real society standards and also expectations that society has for women, especially for new mothers, but also real power dynamics that come within society's expectations. And when we look closely into this book, there are three key themes that keep appearing and that are still relevant nowadays. The first one is how little we understand postpartum mental health and how little we have cared historically. The second topic is how much influence do the medical systems have in women's bodies, especially in pregnancy and motherhood. And the third topic is how women, especially the ones who are struggling with mental health, are viewed as problems to manage rather than people to understand. The first and most obvious topic to talk about is postpartum depression and the rest cure. So if we look into the story, but also we look into the author's life, we see that both the narrator and the author experience what they called temporary nervous condition, which in other words is postpartum depression. So if we look into the data, actually 1 in 7 women globally are actually affected or have actually experienced in some sort of way postpartum depression. And personally, I would say that this number is actually higher than we think because a lot of cases go underreported, not only because in many cultures postpartum depression is viewed as something negative, but also it's viewed as something shameful. So if we look into other names of how we call postpartum depression, we see that something called baby blues has been reported up to 70 or 80% of women. We also see other names like postpartum anxiety, and even in some more extreme cases, we see something called postpartum psychosis. Obviously, this last name or this last diagnosis is more extreme, but all of these cases and all of these different terminologies and diagnoses are quite common when it comes to new motherhood. And all of these diagnoses and symptoms actually are rooted in something very real. And it's that after childbirth, a woman's body goes through one of the major physiological, hormonal, and emotional shifts that anyone can ever have, right? So if we look at hormone levels, right after childbirth, your hormone levels of especially estrogen actually drop, which makes a huge difference in the way that you behave, in the way that your body reacts, but also most importantly, in the way that you feel, right? Because suddenly you have a new baby and you are not the person that you were beforehand or that you were 9 months ago, right? Suddenly you cannot sleep. Obviously, you're taking care of your baby who actually wants to feed every 2 hours. So you have massive sleep deprivation levels. Also, the way you eat and the way you consume food is completely different. And at the same time, your body is still extremely bruised through the gruesome experience of childbirth. Because this is not just a difficult time, this is actually a major medical transition, right? The person that you were before childbirth and the person that you are after having the baby are two completely different people, and they live two completely different lifestyles, right? And this is the thing, even though you have gone through these major, and I would say is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, medical situations that someone can ever have, actually, you are still expected to perform the same role that you had before childbirth, right? You are expected to do all the household chores, to do all the emotional labor, to care for others whilst you are not being cared of or being cared for, right? You are expected to take care of yourself, to take care of your changing body and your majorly hurt and destroyed body, but also taking care of this new creature that is just days old, but also taking care of everyone around you as you have been doing before childbirth. So at the end of the day, obviously, if you have completely changed your life and you are going through one of the biggest medical shifts or psychological shifts that someone could ever go, obviously it makes so much sense that people struggle, because if you don't feel your role or if you don't fulfill people's necessities or people's needs, you are viewed as a failure. Which is exactly where the rest cure and all these sort of treatments appear, which is something that seems ancient, but actually it isn't that old. And sometimes in some populations, these things still happen. And these are common things that we see nowadays still in some cultures. But this rest cure, this specific treatment was actually prescribed to people who experience women, actually, to people who experience things like hysteria, depression, and any other nervous disorders that many people diagnosed women, especially women of color or low class women with. And even though it sounds harmless, because at the end of the day, what you are prescribing someone is to rest, what is happening here is much more different. On paper, this sounds amazing, right? You have your time to rest, your time for quiet time, and obviously your time for recovery. So you can just be for some days in your own room and just not have all these external stimuli that could overwhelm you. Obviously, that will overwhelm and make your postpartum depression worse, as they say, right? But actually, in reality, what happened, and this is something that many women that have experienced this sort of rescue have expressed, is that they have enforced or they are under enforced isolation, no intellectual activity whatsoever, obviously no creative activity either, so no reading, no writing, no painting, no nothing, no music, and also they have extremely limited social contact. And obviously at the end of the day, even though this is meant to be as a way to get your body to rest or get to your body to be quiet and slowly recover, actually what happened is that women were isolated and women were controlled. Instead of asking, what does this woman need in order to heal, the system asks, how can we make this woman manageable again? And this is what happened with this treatment. And this that many women didn't heal from this treatment. It actually destroyed them. And this is exactly what happens in the Yellow Wallpaper, because the narrator doesn't deteriorate despite the treatment. She deteriorates because of it. Because his authority is not only emotional, but it's also institutional. And when we look into how the medical systems operated historically, we see that they had frameworks where women's pain was dismissed, or any sort of symptomatology was usually blamed on emotions or on the woman's mental state. And most importantly, we saw how the expression of our own bodily experience was often seen as unreliable. But then when we look at the data and the medicine nowadays, we see how this is still our reality, right? We see how women's pain is often dismissed, or not as often as before, but it's often viewed as something that we could dismiss. But also we see how women experience severe delays in diagnosis, especially when it comes to any sort of chronic pain diagnosis and mental health diagnosis as well. And then lastly, we see how women's symptoms or any sort of symptoms that women express are often seen as less reliable and also less less serious. And when we look into maternal healthcare, like the way you are and your identity matters heavily. Like, don't even get me started on how different the outcomes are depending on your race, on your age, on your socioeconomic background, or your access to care. That is a whole kind of worms that I don't even want to introduce, but that those kind of worms are very, very real. But the one thing that also I find very disturbing is how in maternal healthcare and even in general medicine, the attention of the doctors don't fall onto the pregnant woman or onto the patient, but to the baby. And don't get me wrong, it makes sense to pay attention to the baby more than to the mother in some context. Pay attention to the sum. But when we look into like maternal healthcare, we see how women's discomfort or the mother's discomfort is often seen as secondary, but also it's often seen as something that is not that important because we are prioritizing the health, the well-being, and the comfort of the baby. Obviously, I also know and take into account that in many cases the mother and the woman will also naturally prioritize the comfort and the health of the baby. But when it comes to like situations where the woman doesn't really need to be uncomfortable or doesn't need to be in pain, we still prioritize the baby, the comfort of the baby, and the existence of said baby. Like, for example, I think it's wild that where like in a situation where a pregnant woman is in dire need of attention, right, of medical attention, where we are choosing between the woman and the baby, there are so many cases where people prioritize the baby, and that is just insane. That is like the biggest and most clear case of sexism and misogyny that I have ever seen. Like, I don't understand in any shape, way, or form, and in any context that people will prioritize a baby over a mother, over a human being. Like, it almost seems as if the mother's needs become secondary, right? Your discomfort is normalized, your needs are invisible, your pain is minimized, but most importantly, you lose all the control that you had over your own body. Suddenly, you're not an individual, you're not a person, you're nothing but an incubator for someone else's life, right? So suddenly your body is not yours anymore, but it's someone else's, right? It's someone else's feeding tube. And then this is exactly what I see in the Yellow Wallpaper, right? Because suddenly this new mother is not herself. She is not an individual that has a loving like a loving husband who is a doctor. Suddenly she is nothing but a victim, nothing but something that has to be controlled, that has to be managed, and something that is a nuisance. And this ties very nicely with the third topic, which is women with mental health issues seen or viewed as broken objects, right? Because when we look into the narrator's character, or when we see how she acts and she behaves, we clearly see from the get-go that she's struggling, right? She is someone who needs some peace, some quiet, and then needs to heal after giving birth to her baby, right? But then the more the story progresses, the more we see that not only she doesn't need any rest, she needs to be stimulated, but also she is not getting the support that she deserves. She is seen again as a nuisance, but also she is seen as a broken object, as something that doesn't know better, something that needs to be like put apart and also like picked back again because she has changed, but also as something that has to be patronized and something that has to be controlled. At its core, this story is about identity, or most importantly, the slow erosion of it. Because if we look into the book, the narrator doesn't even have a name. And this is made on purpose because without a name, she becomes less of a person and more of a role, or at least the roles that she has to fulfill, right? Which in this case are three, which is wife, the role of wife, which is to trust and obey, the role of mother, to nurture and take care, but also lastly the role of patient, which is of being taken care of, obeying, and just be quiet and trust the doctor, aka the husband. And each of these roles come with very specific rules, which is be calm, be quiet, manage yourself, and make sure that you comply and that you obey the rules, right? There is no room for complexity, and also there is no room for humanity in this case, right? She is not allowed to mismanage herself. There is no space for her to be angry or to be frustrated. She can only comply and obey. She can only be quiet and be grateful to be controlled. And the scariest part is the fact that when she deviated from these expectations, and obviously she was not being grateful or quiet or suffering in silence, but actually expressing her anger or her depression, she was not met with empathy or with care or with worry. She was met with correction, with exhaustion, and with paternalization. And this is something that is very common even nowadays, but that historically has been extremely relevant. And this is why medical practices that are, I would say, barbaric, were very common even into the 20th century. Like, for example, institutionalizing women or sedating them or doing electroshock therapy. My own grandma was getting electroshock therapy when she was a child. We're talking 60 years ago. Okay. Like, that is not that far away. And obviously, the one medical treatment that everyone knows about is lobotomy. Lobotomies were happening even into the 20th century. Like, not that long ago, not even 100 years ago, women were getting lobotomized. And mind you, these weren't just done purely for medical reasons. They were done to control. They were done to make sure that everyone was following the path that was expected of them, and also that they didn't become a nuisance. But most importantly, they were done to women to bring them back to what society was expecting of them, which was to make sure that they were compliant, to make sure that they were agreeable, and to make sure that they were quiet. But not all medical treatments have to be as extreme as giving someone a lobotomy. In fact, I would argue that one of the biggest medical treatments to control women, and one of the biggest, and what I consider is one of the biggest drug pandemics that we've had in the last century, is how readily available barbiturates and amphetamines were for normal population, more specifically for women, and more specifically for housewives. We would see women constantly popping pills, popping amphetamines in the morning to wake up, and popping barbiturates during the night to fall asleep in order to cope with social expectations, in order to cope with everything that they had going on, right? With the lack of freedom that they had, the fact that they were anchored to their lives, to this nuclear family that many of them really didn't really want, but also to cope with the social expectations of being the perfect wife, being the perfect mother, and being the perfect woman. They had to constantly be popping these pills that they called mommy's little helpers in order to make sure that they were performing. And this is the thing, this was so common that it was considered something normalized. It was considered something that was normal, right? Seeing your mother not being able to wake up because she had popped one too many pills, or seeing your mom not being able to control her jaw, or just constantly sweating and just trembling because of all the amphetamines that she has taken in the morning, right? And instead of actually talking about the problem and trying to give support to all these drowning women who are clearly struggling because they are taking all these pills that will severely affect their body health, but also most importantly their mental health, what they do is actually blame the woman. Which brings us back to the narrator, and suddenly her descending to madness doesn't seem so sudden. Because if we look into her character, her identity has been stripped, her voice has been dismissed, but most importantly, she has lost all sense of control. And suddenly, the only place where she feels like she can exist freely is the place that trapped her in the first place. At the end of the day, The Yellow Wallpaper is not only a story about madness, it's a story about what happens when someone loses their identity and also their control over their own persona. And this is why I think this story still resonates and is still so relevant nowadays, because even though the specifics have changed, the same questions still remain. And they are: who decides what's healthy and what isn't? Who decides what's real and what should be dismissed? But most importantly, what happens when care becomes control? Which is exactly why we need to be informed. We have to listen to our bodies, and why advocating for ourselves is essential. Because history has shown us over and over and over again that when someone is not allowed to speak, someone else will do it for them. That's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure that you like this video and that you subscribe to my channel. And before you go, I would love to ask you a question, guys. So if you have read this book, I would love to know what you thought of it, and if you have any questions or anything that you would like to add to my commentary, please make sure that you comment down below. I would love to know your opinion. And if you don't really want to comment on this channel or on this video, you can always follow me on my social media. I post that every day, and I post more content regarding this book and any of the books that I have read. But yeah, that's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week, or hopefully I will see you soon. Bye, guys.